Good morning, or I guess good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next installation of the IFAM seminar series. My name is Lucia Petito. I am faculty in the Department of Preventive Medicine. I'm a biostatistician. While we wait for everybody to get settled, no, it went away on my phone. Just make it up every time. So the Q&A. So I think we would like to ask you to please leave your questions till the end. We will be reserving some time at the end for Q&A. If you have questions as Matt is talking and you happen to be online or attending virtually, please type your questions in the chat and we will do our best to address some of the questions that are in the chat as well as anything that comes up in the room. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Matthew Fox from Boston University. He is a professor in the departments of epidemiology and global health. His research has covered a lot of topics probably, but generally focusing in infectious diseases, HIV specifically. He has co-authored a book on quantitative bias analysis, which I recommend taking a look at if you get a chance. More recently, he is a co-host of not one, but two different epidemiology-related podcasts. They are listed up here, Free Associations and Serious Epi. I highly enjoy both of them. So please, if you wouldn't mind, check them out. I think you can find them at your local podcast place where you get podcasts. I don't even know where that is anymore. Yeah, and with that, I will turn it over to you, Matt.
Terrific. Okay, can everybody hear me? All right. So first of all, thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to come and talk with you all. It's one of my favorite parts of my job is getting to get out into the world and actually talk to people. I want to make two sort of general comments right from the beginning. The first one is this is a little bit of a different kind of talk for me in that I'm not actually going to be talking about my own work. This is really a big picture talk on my thoughts on the role of intuition in epidemiology, and I'm going to be talking about a lot of other people's work or just my thoughts in the field. Second, I'm going to be talking about intuition, and I want to be very clear from the beginning that I'm using the term intuition. I'll give some definitional stuff. I'll talk, a little bit about some research focused on this, but I really mean intuition in the general sense, right? Our gut feelings about things. So if there are folks here from the psychological sciences, you may take issue with the way that I use things. Try to be kind. I'm doing my best. So to start us off, I just want to get a show of hands. How many of you in the room believe that birds are real? Show of hands, you believe that birds are real. Okay, so we've got a lot of work to do. Birds are actually not real, as was detailed in this 60 Minutes expose a couple of years ago, in which they did a lot of investigative research to identify the fact that in the 1950s, during the Eisenhower administration, the Eisenhower administration started replacing birds with surveillance devices. And they started releasing more and more of them. These surveillance devices look exactly like birds, such that they outcompeted actual birds as you probably knew them when you were younger. And now all we actually have left are surveillance devices. So those things that you see in the sky that you think of as birds, unfortunately, they are not birds. And as I say, you can go to this online, to this 2022 expose that 60 Minutes did. It was entitled Birds Aren't Real, the Conspiracy Theory that satirizes conspiracy theory because, of course, birds are real. This is a story about a guy who, back during the Trump administration, started going out and protesting at actual protests, holding up signs saying that birds aren't real to satirize conspiracy theories. And as part of that, lots of people actually kind of liked this idea and started joining his movement. He has since stopped doing it, and that's why he's now doing interviews to talk about it. My point here is that when I first said that I believe that birds are not real, you had to make a quick decision, right? You either thought to yourself, this is a joke, Or you thought, what have I gotten myself into? Who is this guy, right? And I am standing here on a stage. I have a degree and I have an appointment at a university until they find out what I'm talking about. And so I have the credentials to stand up here and say things. I can say the most absurd thing, right? And there will be people who choose to believe me. You had to make a quick decision, right? What do I think? Am I being fooled? Or is this real, right? Does he really believe this? And I don't believe him. And you didn't have time to go and Google what I was talking about, but of course you didn't need to, right? You have your own experience. And me standing up here just telling you that birds are not real, you had to make that quick decision. And that's what I want to talk about here, is that sort of that split-second decision that we make, in our case, how we think about mostly cause and effect relationships in epidemiology or in medical fields, and to use that to think a bit about the good and the bad sides of intuition, where I think we're not using it enough and where I think we're making some mistakes. So when I talk about intuition, I want to be clear that, again, I'm not an expert in the field of intuition. But I rely heavily on the work of Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in heuristics and cognitive biases and intuition. And he says that intuition is the ability to automatically generate solutions without long logical arguments or evidence. Now, that is a great definition, and for his purposes was perfect. I'm going to amend that slightly, because in our case, I'm going to change it a little bit to the ability to automatically generate solutions and inferences, right? Because much of what we are doing when we digest the epidemiologic or medical literature is trying to draw inferences about cause and effect. So it's specifically solutions and inferences, often about evidence. In other words, Kahneman's definition is in the absence of evidence. We are often making judgments about evidence, right? And we have to make decisions as to whether or not we believe a purported relationship is a cause and effect relationship when the body of evidence may be conflicting, right? We have to decide what is good and what is bad. Kahneman talks about this in terms of system 1 and system 2 thinking. We have fast thinking systems where we are able to make snap judgments, and then we have slow thinking systems where we can reason things out. And we move back and forth between those in trying to make judgments. The question is, what do we really use when we are looking at the epidemiologic literature? Now, Kahneman says, or other research says, that it takes about 10 years to get really good intuitions about a particular topic, which is good news for us, because we all have training in medical research, epidemiology, whatever it is, and most of you probably have 10 years under your belt already, or you will be there very soon. And therefore, we, within the fields that we are studying, should actually have good intuitions. Now, I want to distinguish intuition from insight, right? Intuition is sensing, insight is seeing, right? We're actually seeing. And again, this gets to that dichotomy between slow and fast thinking. There's a test that's been developed, there are a number of them, but to think about insight, which is called the remote associates test. And the idea here is I give you 3 words. You have to give me a word that connects them. So for example, if I give you widow, bite, and monkey, you might say spider. If I give you bald, screech, and emblem, you might say eagle. That's insight, right? I look at 3 words and I think about a way to connect them. I'm using reason and logic. But what's interesting about this test is that when people are asked, so they're given the 3 words, and the 3 words could either be a random set of words, or they could be 3 words that have a word that generally is likely to connect them. And you ask people to make a split-second judgment, is there a word that connects them? People do quite a bit better than chance. In other words, we have a sense, because we have decades of experience looking at words and drawing inferences, that we have a sense as to whether or not these words are connected or not. We don't get it right all the time, but we do a lot better than chance, which is 50-50, which is what you would expect. And so why do we actually have intuition? What is it for, sort of from a biological sense? And then how do we use it as epidemiologists? Well, one is it helps us survive and flee danger, right? If I can have intuitive senses about where the predators are, I'm more likely to be able to avoid them and survive. The second reason is it helps us simplify really difficult tasks, and it helps us make decisions, right? There's a lot of information coming at us all the time, and if we had to reason about every single decision we wanted to make, we wouldn't get through our days. So it helps us really simplify tasks that would be much harder to do otherwise. And the third reason is it helps us not get fooled. When I gave you that example in the beginning of birds aren't real, you are mostly relying on your fear of being deceived, right? You don't want to believe me when I'm saying birds are real, even though I'm saying it in a straight face, right? Because if it turns out that I am just making some rhetorical point, which is the most likely explanation, you don't want to then have to say, oh, I believed him. I thought maybe there was something I didn't know, right? You don't want to be that person. And we as humans hate being fooled. So that's a really strong motivation. Now, in our case, when it comes to the literature, we don't want to be fooled in the sense of we don't want to buy into causal relationships, when in fact, what we're actually looking at is bias or random error. So it's those last two, I think, that we are most interested in, right? We're interested in simplifying judgmental tasks that are complicated, and we're interested in avoiding getting the wrong answer because the data fooled us. Okay. Now, what's interesting about intuition is more likely to be the system that we rely on when decisions have to be made. If I'm just looking at a study or a body of literature, I can reason about it all I want, right? I can come up with reasons why it's a good study and reasons why it's a bad study. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter until I actually have to make the decision. You know, if I'm a policymaker, am I going to decide there's enough evidence for a causal relationship that we should change policy? Then I've got to make a decision. And there, intuition comes into play much more than we'd like to admit. We'd like to think that it's all based on reason, but actually intuition comes in quite a bit when it comes to decision making. Keep that in the back of your head. The other thing to keep in mind is intuitions are emotional. And that's a problem for us, right? Because we're scientists. So there's a lot of research that suggests that people are much more likely to change their travel plans when they have a dream that the plane they're going to be flying on crashes, much more than when there's an actual travel warning about traveling to the place they're going. People are much more likely to change their plans. People believe first guess, best guess when it comes to taking tests. People believe I had some intuitive sense that this was the right answer, and therefore that is what I should go with, even though there have been lots of studies where they've looked at standardized tests where you can actually look where people have either crossed out or erased answers, and you are much more likely to get the right answer when you've sat and reasoned it out and not relied on your intuition. But our emotional sense says first guess, best guess. And for our purposes, there's also a lot of literature on executives and how they make decisions. And turns out that they spend a lot of time analyzing data and having data analyzed for them. And it ends up in the situation of analysis paralysis. There's so much evidence going in lots of different directions. Eventually, I just need to make a decision. And most often, what do people rely on? Intuition. They go with their gut. And we, as epidemiologists and medical researchers, we do the same. We don't necessarily like to admit it, but we do a fair bit of the same. The problem is we're not supposed to do that, right? We're scientists. We rely on evidence and data, not emotions and intuition. But I'm going to argue that it is a big part of what we actually do, and therefore, we should understand it. We should understand the implications. And to give you an example of this, and I'm only going to use myself, but how many of you are aware of this 2023 study that came out from the Cochrane Library on physical interventions to interrupt or reduce the spread of respiratory viruses, became known as the COVID masks study? And it came out, and people had very strong feelings about this study. But those are feelings, right? Isn't that the point of what we're talking about here? And then Brett Stevens of the New York Times wrote this: the mask mandates did nothing. Will any lessons be learned? I'm looking at you, epidemiologists, right? That's what he's effectively saying, right? This was a study that said there's really no good evidence to suggest that COVID is prevented by wearing masks. I'm not going to go through the individual studies. I will show you there is a lot of actual evidence that went into this, and I'm not going to go through the individual studies to determine whether we think this is a good study or a bad study. I will, however, point to you, notice the dates here. These are not studies of COVID at all. These were studies of respiratory viruses, period, not studies of whether or not COVID was prevented by wearing masks. That's not my point. My point is not whether this is a good study or a bad study. My point is when this study came out, I had spent 2 years prior to this, maybe 3 at that point, arguing online and social media that people should be wearing masks, which is to say I had feelings when this study came out, right? And I have to be honest about that because when I saw this study, my first thought was, I need to go and figure out why this is wrong. That's not science, right? Science doesn't say, let me figure out how this is wrong. My science should say, let's evaluate this and see if it's good or bad. But we can't do that. We have emotions that come along with our feelings about causal relationships. And we need to be upfront about them, but we also need to understand the implications for those feelings if we are to get to a situation where we are really generating good evidence about cause and effect relationships. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of how intuition works. And it's a baseball example, which I thought was appropriate given today is opening day. It's also, because it's a baseball example and I'm from Boston, my opportunity to remind you, the Yankees are terrible. Just want to point that out there. So I'm going to give you the following example, and I'm going to ask you to answer this in your head as quickly as you possibly can, right? I want you to reason. Just come to the answer as quickly as you can. So imagine I tell you that a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Okay, you came to an answer in your head, and we can actually reason out that the answer is 5 cents. But if you're like me, I'm going to guess when you went to this quickly, your first intuition was 10 cents, right? And then when you had a chance to think about it, you worked it out in your head that actually can't be right. So what you did there was you shifted from that system 1 to system 2 thinking. You go with intuition, but then when you have time to actually sit and reason it out, you identify the problem with your logic, which is to say our emotional side of reason is generally good, but it can be fooled. And we have to be aware of that in order to get to the right answer. So you started with intuition, you moved to reason. The problem is, sorry to Yankees fans, but you have way more money than we do. It's been a bad couple of years. The problem with epidemiology or medical research is there is no rule-based solution that I can do to get to the answer of, is there cause and effect relationship when I see data? And therefore, because there's always going to be a body of evidence, and much of that evidence is going to be conflicting, to a certain extent, I am always going to have to rely on intuition. Again, that's not a bad thing, but it comes with predictable errors that we should be aware of and try and avoid. And the thing about intuitions, though, when intuitions get wrapped up in probability, turns out we're not actually all that good at having intuitions around probability. So this was a study done right here in Chicago. Maybe somebody in this room was involved in this. They were trying to predict flu transmission with the aid of George Washington. In other words, what they were doing was trying to understand infectious disease transmission dynamics by looking at how dollar bills move through populations, trying to understand that contact rate. The author of the study was quoted as saying, if you have 2,000 cases of flu in a country of 300 million, most people, definitely me, think they're going to be one of the 2,000 and not the 299 odd million. Which is to say, even those of us who have good training in statistics and probability theory and epidemiology, we're actually not all that good at having good intuitions when it comes to probability. I definitely think anytime I hear there's an outbreak of something, I am definitely the next one who's going to get it. even though the chances have to be incredibly low at that point. But I'm convinced. Now, sometimes our intuitions are really good and they're helpful, though. So this was a study that says corn oil improves plasma lipoprotein lipid profile compared with extra virgin olive oil in men. Results from a randomized trial. Okay, randomized trial, that sounds pretty good, right? Don't get a lot of randomized trials in the nutrition field. So apparently the Mediterranean diet that we're all supposed to be following is garbage. Then you read a little further and you find out that this study was funded by ACH Food Companies and PepsiCo, makers of Mazola corn oil. Amazing. Companies with a vested interest in the results of the research find exactly what would be beneficial to them. Now, I am not trying to suggest that I've read through the study and can tell you it's a good study or a bad study, but I can tell you that my intuitive sense is when I find out who the funder is and the funder has a vested interest in the results turning out a specific way, my bar for accepting it goes up. Doesn't mean it can't be met, but it goes up. And I think that's a good use of our intuitive senses. The problem that becomes, we also have incentives. We also have biases. We also have a vested interest in the results of our work turning out a specific way. I'm not trying to suggest that we have a financial interest necessarily. Sometimes we do, but rarely. But we have a vested interest in the idea that I need to publish papers in order to get the next grant, in order to publish the papers that eventually get me to promotion. So I also have a vested interest in the way that things turn out. I have my own reasons for wanting the work to turn out a specific way. And if we don't acknowledge that, our intuitions about research become potentially problematic. There's also some interesting work that suggests that as we enter into this world of data visualization, this is a preprint, and I don't want to make too much of it because this is a preprint in 2021, and as far as I can tell, and I keep looking, I haven't actually seen it in publication yet, so I don't know exactly what's become of it. But they did these sort of interesting experiments where they had people looking at graphs, data visualizations, I should say, and they changed the attractiveness of the graphs. And then they had people rate them on how attractive they thought these different graphs were. And then they asked them to tell them how much they trusted the data based on, based on their own feelings. And it turns out that the attractiveness of a visualization correlates really well with trust in the data, which is to say our intuitions are also bound up in prestige, right? How good something looks can very much influence whether or not we believe there is, say, a causal relationship. And we have to be aware of that as well. I'm someone who loves these New York Times and Washington Post data visualizations that they do all the time. This is one done right here in Chicago, looking at the relationship between poverty and violence. And you could look at that and say, that's a really nice visualization. Therefore, I'm going to trust it's good data and I can draw conclusions. I'm not sure you want to do that, right? There are lots of reasons, and I'll give you my favorite example. Here's a visualization of data from the Washington Post. The headline was coronavirus vaccine protection was much weaker against Omicron, data shows. And they have this nice visualization. They have the imprint of the Washington Post stamped on it. Take a look at that graph. And everybody in this room knows you cannot draw causal conclusions based on a crude display of rates of COVID, right? This data suffers from selection bias, surveillance bias, measurement issues, confounding. Nobody should be drawing causal conclusions from this data. But let's pretend we could. Let's pretend that we actually could. The inference here depends on the scale you're looking at. So it is true that you were 15 times as likely to be infected during the Delta wave if you were unvaccinated, and only 7 times more likely during the Omicron wave. But if you look on the different scale, the scale that we actually care about for public health, you are much better off, you are much more protected during the Omicron wave. The benefit was much, much greater, right? But the headline tells me one thing, comes from a trusted source, maybe, maybe not. nice visualization of the data, we can be fooled into trusting and not doing the work ourselves of actually switching to that system two thinking about what we actually think about the results. And this gets us to heuristics. So this is what Kahneman, one of the main pieces of work that he and a colleague won the Nobel Prize for. Heuristics are part of this intuitive sense. Heuristics are these strategies that we use as humans to simplify judgmental tasks that would be too difficult to solve rationally. In other words, if every time I wanted to cross a street, I had to sit down with a pen and paper and do a calculation as to whether the car coming at me is going to be in the space that I want to be at the time I expect to be there, I would never get across the street. So we can't do that. So we need these shortcuts that allow us to function in the world and make decisions quickly. And they're great. They are amazing. We want these. The problem is that they come with some well-known and well-described biases, of which Kahneman was one of the original folks to describe them. They can go wrong in some very predictable ways. And there are ways that affect us in our judgments of the epidemiologic literature. And these are referred to as cognitive biases. There are two really nice papers that influenced my thinking on this. This one was from Epidemiology by Tim Lash. This one was in the American Journal of Epidemiology by Sandra Greenland, both talking about heuristics and need for more training in heuristics among epidemiologists and medical students. And to give you an example of this, so imagine you decide you are going to buy an SUV. And your number one criteria is you want the most reliable car there is, most reliable SUV there is. So you go and look at the data. You go to Consumer Reports, you find out what the best car is. In the old days, you could have called up the Car Talk guys. I don't know if I'm dating myself with the Car Talk guys, but you get the idea, right? And you say, all the data and all the experts tell me the Honda SUV is the Honda CR-V is the most reliable SUV on the market, hands down. It's not even a question. So what do? You call up your friend and you say, hey, I'm gonna buy a Honda CR-V. Can you drive me over to the dealership? And your friend says, oh, no. You don't want to buy that car. I had one of those, broke down all the time. That's one piece of evidence, which we call an anecdote. The question now is, do you buy the car? If you are like most people, and certainly like me, you do not buy the car. Why? Because we are humans who are very easily influenced by powerful anecdotes. We are storytellers by nature. And one anecdote can trump all of the data. And we saw this happen all the time during COVID. We refer to this as the tyranny of the anecdote, sometimes also called salience bias. Sometimes it's availability heuristic, various things that this would fall under. But the idea here being that we are very susceptible to anecdotes, even if we have been trained to look at data. Unless you don't believe me, again, unless you are different from me, how many times during the COVID pandemic were you influenced not by what the data said, but by what happened to your friends and family? I was incredibly susceptible to this. Why? Because one powerful anecdote from somebody I know is much more influential in my thinking than is the data. That's okay, right? That's a part of life. But we have to be aware of this and shift ourselves back towards making decisions based on data. Now, there's a whole lot of work that's been done on these cognitive biases. You can go to the Wikipedia page and spend a day, a week, a month going through them. They are grouped into all these different categories. My favorite of all of the cognitive biases is the G.I. Joe fallacy, which is the tendency to think that knowing about a cognitive bias is enough to overcome it. Based on the old, at least when I was a kid, G.I. Joe, knowing is half the battle. Keep that in mind as I get to the end, because I'm going to propose some thoughts, some solutions to this. But at the end of the day, just knowing about these biases really isn't enough to overcome them. We have to be really vigilant when it comes to these heuristics. Okay, So where do we actually see heuristics when it comes to us in the epidemiologic literature? Well, if you pull any study in the epidemiologic or medical literature, every single paper, barring a few, will have some quantification of random error. P-value, confidence interval, Bayes factor, whatever it is. There are some exceptions, very large studies, but if you're talking about a cause and effect study, you're almost always going to see quantification of random error. We wouldn't allow somebody to get through peer review without it. We also insist that people adjust for important known measured confounders, right? Imagine I decide I'm going to do the study, does alcohol cause lung cancer? And I know that smoking is a big confounder, so I collect information on smoking, but you know what, I decide, you know what, I don't feel like adjusting for it. What I'll do instead is rather than adjusting for it, I'll just mention it as a limitation. None of you would let me get away with that, right? And yet, when it comes to every other source of bias, unmeasured confounder, selection bias, information bias, that is exactly what we do. We let them put it in the limitation section, which is always, almost always, in the exact same place, right? Where is it? It's in the discussion section, close to the end. It's the second to last paragraph. Why? Because you don't want to end on a downer. So you give the limitations after you've already really drawn the conclusions. And that discussion section, that limitation section, is all about intuition. So this is just a random study pulled from the New England Journal of Medicine. You can pull any journal, any article you want, and you read down to the discussion section, and they say, our study has several limitations. Exposure data were collected retrospectively and are therefore sensitive to recall bias. Sure, I buy that. However, since participants are not likely to expect that the use of statins is related to the risk of colorectal cancer, any resulting misclassification is most likely non-differential and would tend to attenuate true associations. Aha, we found something. Non-differential misclassification would bias towards the null. So anything we found, the effect size is probably actually larger, so really leave us alone, right? That is effectively what these discussion sections come down to. But our job as epidemiologists is not to say, is there an effect? Isn't there an effect? Our job is to quantify that effect. How much actually matters? Because if you tell me that eating ice cream causes cancer, I don't know how to make any decision as to whether or not I should eat the ice cream because I really like ice cream. If you tell me the relative risk is 1.1, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to keep eating the ice cream. If you tell me the relative risk is 10, well, I'm going to think about it, right? So we need to know how much. And what this discussion section, this limitation section forces me to do is rely on my intuition. I have to make a calculation in my head as to what I think the actual effect size would have been had these biases been absent, because there's no quantification, despite the fact that we have methods and have had them since the 1950s and 60s to quantify the impact of various sources of systematic error. But we don't do that. We just rely on intuition. How good are we, though? We have training, and therefore we should be able to do this in our heads, right? We should be able to say, I know how much, how bad the measurement was. I should be able to make some calculations in my head and do that adjustment, right? We have training, and if we have training, we should be able to do that, and presumably that's what happens in the peer review process, right? Because ultimately I have to make a decision, do I recommend this study for publication knowing it has flaws, or do I think the flaws are so big, I cannot let this go out into the literature? Knowing full well it'll just go to another journal, but that's another issue. That's another issue. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. So I have a colleague who worked with us on the first edition of our textbook, Eliza Fink, and she was interested in, back in the early 2000s, the question of whether or not smoking during pregnancy increased the risk of incident breast cancer. And part of the reason she was interested in this was there had been a study by Innes and Byers that came out in 2001, and they found roughly a 5-fold increased risk of incident breast cancer associated with smoking during pregnancy. And she wanted to replicate this with a similar design, a case control study done in registry data in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And Eliza does her replication study, and she finds nothing, no association between smoking during pregnancy and incident breast cancer. So now she's left in the position of having to try and figure out, why did she find one thing and they found another? Because she's going to submit this to a journal and they're going to ask questions as to why hers is so different from the other major study done on this topic. And she's got limitations that she needs to actually acknowledge. Let me tell you what the biggest limitation was. The biggest limitation was I didn't tell you where Eliza got the information on smoking during pregnancy. She got the information from birth certificates. There is a question on the birth certificate that asks, did you smoke during your pregnancy? And if so, how much and during what trimesters? Now that you know that, you have to factor that into your assessment of Eliza's study. And presumably you have to do some calculation in your head as to how much bias that's going to create, right? Does that get us from what Eliza observed, nothing, to what Innes and Byers found, 5? Does it get us halfway there, some of the way there, none of the way there? We have training in this, and we have intuitions about how much misclassification there is likely to be. Now, if I have estimates of the sensitivity and specificity of the misclassification, and I should be clear, this is expected to be non-differential misclassification because the smoking information comes before there is any diagnosis of breast cancer. So we'd expect this to be non-differential misclassification. If I have estimates of the sensitivity and specificity, I can actually mathematically adjust for the bias. But in most cases, we don't do that. We rely on our intuition. We also rely on intuition as to how bad the misclassification is. You all have, now that I've told you, the ability to make a judgment. How bad do you think the misclassification is? I don't know the answer. Nobody knows the answer for sure. But I can tell you we're interested in a very specific problem. We're not worried here about specificity. Nobody gives birth, didn't smoke during their pregnancy, and then when a doctor asks them, did you smoke during your pregnancy, says, they'll think, oh, cool, if I tell them I smoked. Nobody does that. Sensitivity is the problem. It's that we have so much messaging that you shouldn't smoke during your pregnancy that women or people giving birth who smoked may not tell you that they did. And in fact, I don't know the answer as to how bad it is, but I'm going to guess it's really low. I'm going to say I think it's in the neighborhood of 30%. But now that you know that, go with your intuition, right? How much does it change the point estimate? Do we get to what Innes and Byers found or not? Do we stop somewhere in between? Up to you to decide. But I can tell you that what Eliza did was she went to the literature and looked at all the validation data that had been done on this particular question. And if you look on the right side, you can see specificity is really high, as we would expect, but sensitivity is kind of all over the place and could be as low as 29%. Could be even lower, right? Because our population might be different from these. You're free to decide what you think it is, but let me show you what happens when we actually quantify the impact based on varying assumptions. The top row would be what would happen if we assumed that Eliza's data was perfectly classified, which is to say sensitivity and specificity are both perfect, which we know isn't true. The point estimate was 0.96. All the other estimates are what you get if you adjust for that misclassification. You can see the point estimate moves almost not at all, even when sensitivity is terrible, 25%. Specificity matters, but we're not worried about specificity. We're worried about sensitivity, which is to say this result is simply not susceptible to the actual value of sensitivity. And this matters for a number of reasons, one of which is if you were the peer reviewer and all you knew was the source of information, you might justifiably say, I don't trust this, throw this information out, when in fact you would be throwing out what is actually probably very good information. Our intuition is not enough here. It's also really helpful to know because it also tells us that if we go and do another study to try and figure out which one was right, which one was wrong, or we're not really about right and wrong, right? We're about how much are they different from each other. We would be wasting resources by putting our money, which is always limited, into a better measure of smoking during pregnancy, because as long as it's non-differential and specificity is high, really doesn't matter what the sensitivity is. And we would be wasting resources by channeling them away from things that might actually be sources of error into something that isn't. Quantification gets us out of the relying on intuition. Now, does that mean intuition is bad? Not necessarily. So I have been asking my students for years, this is not real, but imagine that we actually had betting markets set up around epidemiologic results. And let's say that we instituted a rule that said every time you publish a paper, you have to put up $1,000 of your own money, can't be grant money, can't be institutional funds, $1,000 of your own money. And if within 10 years, your finding is proven correct, and I know we could never actually come up with a definition of what that means, but let's pretend we could. If you were proven correct, you'd get $5,000 back. But if you were wrong, we'd keep the $1,000. How many fewer papers do you think would be published? I'm going to guess a lot fewer papers, which is to say we have intuitions about our own work, but we don't have an incentive structure set up to hold us to those intuitions. By the way, keep in mind, you'd only have to be right 1 in 5 times to break even. And I still would bet there would be far fewer papers published. And we actually have some evidence on this because in the psychological sciences have been going through the whole replication crisis. And they actually have set up these systems to actually try and replicate some of the key findings. So this was a set of replication studies done on papers published in Nature and Science. So presumably high impact findings. They didn't just go out and try to replicate them. They also set up betting markets. And they asked people in the field, I'm going to give you some money, and you bet on whether or not you think each one of these findings is going to replicate. And what they found was that people bet on about 63.4% of these particular studies replicating, when in fact 61.9% of them actually replicated, which is to say we have intuitions about what's actually in the literature we're reading, and we're actually pretty good at having those intuitions be right. Now, this is a particular field. Does it mean it applies to medicine? Not necessarily, but I'd be interested to see if we set up something similar, whether or not our intuitions would be just as good. So that's focusing on the intuition and systematic error. I also want to think a little bit about intuition and random error. And I'm specifically going to focus on the impact that null hypothesis significance testing has on our intuitions. So null hypothesis significance testing says there is no role for intuition in evidence. We have a system that is set up. It's supposed to be objective. We turn the crank, the frequentist crank, and we get out an answer as to whether or not something is or is not statistically significant. We have chosen to somehow believe that that makes it meaningful, but I leave that to another time. And so there's no role for intuition. There's no role for emotion. I don't get to say, well, my p-value was 0.06, but I feel like this is the right answer, right? Although actually we kind of do, right? Because we have this whole field of study devoted to euphemisms for almost statistically significant that people publish in the literature, despite the fact that when people get a p-value of 0.049, nobody says it was almost not statistically significant. It seems to all go in one direction. So we do actually kind of bring our emotional feelings into this. But remember, this forces us into a binary decision. It either is or is not statistically significant. And when decisions have to be made, intuition starts to creep up. The problem with that is our intuitions are based off of systems that don't actually exist in the world we live in. Our intuitions are based on the methodology of significance testing, not the actual body of literature that we get to evaluate. So I'm sure everybody knows this paper going back to 1995, Ioannidis, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. I'm guessing you have feelings about it. Isn't that the point? I have feelings about it too, but I do think there are some really interesting things in here. One of which is Ioannidis makes the point that we live in a world of publication bias, right? We mostly only publish these statistically significant findings. So this was a paper from Barnett in 2019 that pulled all the p-values and confidence intervals from 1976 to 2019 in PubMed and plotted them out on a scale, and the distribution looks like this. Could plot a nice normal distribution on top of that, right? We publish the statistically significant findings. We publish some null findings, quote unquote null findings, but most of what we publish are the statistically significant results, which means if you are looking at the literature, it's very likely that what you are looking at is a statistically significant finding. And the problem with that is, I ask my students every year, okay, if you look at a study published in the literature that is statistically significant, what are the chances that that study is a false positive? And let's assume that that study is the perfect study. So we're not worried about systematic error, reasonably powered study. What are the chances that that study is a false positive? And they will almost always tell me 5%. And that would be true if we lived in a world where everything got published and we knew the denominator of true and false studies, right? Because then alpha and beta, right, our significance level and our power, function in the same way that sensitivity and specificity do when it comes to a biologic test. And so we think of significance testing as being an issue of sensitivity, right? Given the body of true studies out there, what proportion of them will come up as true positive findings, and therefore what proportion are going to be false negatives. And I can do the same thing with the negatives. But in reality, we are looking at conditioned on a positive finding. In other words, conditioned on a statistically significant result. Now our judgment has to be a positive predictive value question. Given that it made it into the literature, what are the chances that a positive finding is a true positive finding? And now, as we know from testing, that depends on the baseline probability that something was true before we ever did the study. Now, we don't know what that is, but Ioannidis argues that it's very low, that we test lots of things all the time. We only publish the significant ones. And so maybe it's as low as 10%. And if it were as low as 10%, then the probability that a finding in the literature that is a statistically significant result is a true positive would be 68%. And then you start to add in bias, and it starts to go down even more. Others have argued that that prevalence is probably too low, that we are actually targeted in what we do. It doesn't matter. The point is, our intuitions are set up based on a system that isn't the one that we actually live in. We don't live in the perfect world where we know the truth and we see all the literature. We're in the world of skimming off all the significant findings and trying to draw inferences about them. So we need to shift the way that we think about this. I also ask my students, okay, so imagine there is truly an effect of an exposure on an outcome. If that is the case, and I do a perfect randomized trial, am I more likely to observe a p-value of 0.01 or a p-value of 0.56? And they will almost always tell me 0.01. Then I say, okay, if there is truly no effect of the exposure on the outcome, are you more likely to observe a p-value of 0.01 or 0.56? And they will almost always tell me 0.56. The first one is correct, but the second one isn't, because we don't actually teach students much about what the expected distribution of p-values looks like. So what you're looking at here is a p-curve. It's the distribution. If you had done this experiment over and over and over, what would the distribution of p-values look like? And if there is an effect of the exposure on the outcome, the curve is going to be, I think we say right skewed, I never remember. The tail is on the right, you know what I'm talking about? Such that lower p-values are much more likely than higher p-values. Doesn't mean we can't get a high p-value, but most of the time we're going to get low p-values and much lower than 0.05. The shape of this curve is going to change depending on the effect size and the sample size, but that's the curve we expect. Whereas if there is truly no effect of the exposure on the outcome, the curve is completely flat, which is to say the probability of getting a p-value of 0.56 is exactly the same as the probability of 0.01. It's just that 5% of the time, we're going to be in that tail area, less than 0.05, but every value is equally as likely. And yet we don't teach students to think about this intuitively. And yet our intuitions can be trained here to do quite well. And this matters because of Lindley's paradox. The idea here is what you have here is a p-curve for an effect of an exposure on an outcome, and then the flat line is a p-curve for no effect. And if you look for this particular curve, and different curves obviously will have different shapes, but the flat line will always be the flat line. there is an area between 0.03 and 0.05 where p-values between 0.03 and 0.05 are more likely under the null than they are under the hypothesis that there is an effect. Our intuitions are often completely backwards in that area close to 0.05. Now, a huge study, right, this problem goes away, or a large effect size, because the curve is such that you're not going to have that large area of overlap. But for moderately sized studies, or in the world that we live in, where effects that we're measuring are often small, that p-value area of 0.03 to 0.05 can be a little bit dangerous to draw inferences. And there was a really nice study by Darcy Holman, who went out and surveyed epidemiologists. This goes back a little bit of a ways, but I think things still hold. He surveyed epidemiologists in Australia and New Zealand by giving them these synthetic literature reviews in which they would change numbers or factors in the literature review, and then they would send them out to people and ask them to grade them as to whether or not they believed there was a cause and effect relationship or not. And then they modeled what predicted whether or not people said there was a cause and effect relationship. And strength of association played a role, but the biggest predictor was the p-value, despite the fact that we know we should not be simply looking at p-values to determine cause and effect. You were 7 times more likely, or the odds was 7 times higher, to assess cause and effect if the p-value was less than 0.001 compared to if it was above 0.05. But they went further, and they actually modeled the probability of assessing causation as a function of the actual p-value with a splines with a knot at 0.05. And what you see is a decreasing probability of people being willing to say there's a cause and effect relationship as the p-value gets higher until you get to 0.05. And then there's a sort of weird thing where it drops. And actually, we're more likely to assess causation if the p-value is like 0.06. And again, I think this is about intuition, right? If you get a p-value really close to 0.05, I'm a little skeptical of what you've done there. And so I may be more or less likely to assess causation based on whether you're on this side or that side of the curve. You get 0.06, okay, that's more believable, and I understand that. But you got exactly 0.05, something's fishy going on there, right? Because we have, oh, and by the way, Charlie Poole wrote a fantastic editorial on this, in which he said those who participate in teaching null hypothesis testing uncritically to epidemiology students should have this figure tattooed on their foreheads in reverse image to remind them at each glance of the pox they continue to spread on our field. Charlie has a way with words, but I love him. But you have this problem of p-hacking, right? Something that is so pervasive that John Oliver is actually talking about it, right? The idea that if I just put one more variable into the model, I'm going to get it just below 0.05, and then I can publish it. And that throws off that whole distribution, right? Because this was a journal, Psychological Sciences, went and pulled all the p-values out of their journals. And what they found was things followed that really nice p-curve that you'd expect, except for this one little point just below 0.05. What is that? That is p-hacking. That is people who just kept adding things to a model until they got the answer that they wanted. And so when it comes to intuition, I am inherently skeptical of p-values really close to 0.05. Is that fair? Probably not to the individuals who are doing the studies, but as a body of literature, I think it's a reasonable approach. We should be concerned about being fooled when it comes to p-values very close to 0.05. And so I just want to end with just some thoughts on where I think we can go from here. None of them, unfortunately, are very satisfying, because ultimately this is a really hard problem. I do think that if we move to quantifying everything we can, including sources of systematic error, and then only relying on intuition when we must, I think we will do better. I think we need to train people in heuristics and bias so that we can draw better inferences. I think we need feedback on these to be able to realize what we are doing. But ultimately, I think the biggest thing we need to do is be aware of it, understand that our intuitions are helpful, but they have limitations, and try to use them as effectively as you can, but be aware they come with biases. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to take any questions. And again, hopefully you won't hold me to the exact definitions of things that I was talking about because I recognize I'm not using the perfectly accepted definitions. Hopefully you get the idea. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful. I guess we're going to open up the floor for a couple of questions now. Okay. Sorry. I'm going to run around the room like a crazy person.
I'd make a Phil Donahue reference, but nobody knows. Nobody.
I do.
Yeah, nobody here knows who that is. So Jeff Linder, I'm a general internist and clinician scientist, and it's bizarre. I've given your talk like 40% of this talk, and in the context of physician decision making, and the the punchline of my talk is, doctoring is an inherently social, emotional activity.
Yeah.
And so like Daniel, so it's very weird to see like, you did it way better. But like,
I just took your slides.
yeah,
that's all I
exactly.
did.
But right down. And actually, I actually grabbed the microphone just to say, I don't know if you realize Daniel Kahneman died yesterday.
I did not know that.
So I thought you were going to mention that. So, but I think we should.
Oh my gosh,
that should be mentioned.
Completely missed it
before moving on. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's very timely.
So White Sox opening day and the day after.
Yes.
Wow.
Daniel Kahneman's.
Wow. Thank you for telling me that.
Yeah. But great talk. Really enjoyed it and totally agree. I mean, and the thing, that 10 years you're talking about when we're all looking at data, our own data, or evaluating others' work, that moment where you're like, and you go into it with skepticism, like, does this feel right?
Yeah.
Like is so much of what we do.
It is. And I think, again, I think we get better at this over time, but I definitely felt myself, and I just had to admit this to myself at some point during COVID, being pulled into this idea of I had my preconceived notions as to what was right, and no amount of data was going to change my mind. And when I recognized that, I was able to step back. But we live in a world of so much noise, right? When these things become political, it's very hard to admit that you are relying on something that is not data. Once you do that, I think you're in a better place, but it's still very hard to come back to, I'm just going to focus on the data. It's really challenging.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. And I think we have to wrap up.
Sorry, I went long, but thank you for your attention.
Yes. Okay, thank you.